Is it time for a mind shift? If you don't know what that means, then join your host, Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Christian pastor and Bible college teacher of over 20 years, along the journey of deconstruction and reconstruction of faith, life, religion, and spirituality.
I'm glad to be connecting with Michael from the Religious Addicts Anonymous website. You do a lot of writing on the RAA website, which is religiousaddicts.wordpress.com. Thanks, Michael, for dropping into Mindshift Podcast.
Thank you very much, Clint.
Yes, very much enjoy. We actually had a little chat last week and had a couple of internet connectivity problems, but in a way, this is turning into a good thing because I was able to spend a bit more time going through the RAA website. There's a lot of really interesting articles on there, and it's something I'd never really heard of. Can you describe and define what a religious addict is?
Yeah, let me have a go. I mean, probably the place to start is to say that sort of in humility, in a way, we don't know that much about it, and we're sort of trying to find out. So there hasn't been a lot of literature on this, really. There's a few academic articles, a book by a writer called Leo Booth, and there's still a collection of people in our very small fellowship. But just some sort of reference points. In our town, when we were growing up, there was a man dressed as Jesus walking around. He wasn't Jesus, by the way.
Okay, just put that out there. Let's clarify that.
Yeah, just in case anyone's wondering. And he carried a sort of wooden cross. And people were quite kind to him, you know, because they knew that he had something that wasn't quite right with him. Maybe he was a religious addict because something in his brain started to take on, some speculating really, but take on the idea, which is quite common in the church, but not quite so uncontained, that there was something special about him, that there was something even more chosen than you would, you know, simply, okay, you're chosen in Ephesians 1 or wherever it is, but these people are even more chosen. And I think some of us who are sort of coming out of that faith, that type of faith, have had those moments where we feel like, oh, I could be the next kind of Moses, I could be the next Isaiah, maybe in a great worship meeting. So maybe it's people with a vulnerability to sort of brain chemistry or experiences that kind of take them a bit higher than other people. And there's a window there of it becoming compulsive and a major coping mechanism, in the same way like people who might have a bet or a gamble and not become a gambling addict, or they're not a workaholic, even though they work hard. But there's a certain vulnerability in process addicts that is there, and people find themselves in that environment and they kind of go in that direction.
Mm-hmm. And as we talked about last week, it's not limited to certainly evangelical Christianity, is it? I think both you and I came out of that background, didn't we? But you found yourself developing into a religious addict, didn't you, in your time in Christianity? What were the symptoms? What did it look like for you?
Okay, I've got the big ones I've got. And so when I first started writing the blog, I was like, I bet everyone gets the real trancey thing where they put on, and no disrespect to Hillsong or Beth or the musicians who I'm sure are very sincere, but you put that music on. And to me, when I put Bethel on, like you could put me on a brain, you know, chart thing, and my brain chemistry just goes bong, like, you know, Holy Spirit, and then I'm just like straight away something happens in my brain. The lights come on. Now, for years I lived under the impression that I was so close to God that it would just light up in me as soon as it kind of happened, and that would sort of, not only was it kind of euphoric, it was also sort of trancey. So the trance thing is one side of it, and I suppose people in charismatic Pentecostal denominations could be more vulnerable to that. At the same time, you have other things like magical thinking, obsession over, you know, things that you might have done wrong. You know, have I committed the, you know, unforgivable sin, the sin against the Holy Spirit? I mean, that has dogged believers since whoever wrote it down, you know, and that relates to something in Catholicism which they've understood and called scrupulosity, where you literally obsess about something that you feel like you can't be forgiven for. Just obviously today we might call that OCD as well, from a certain another vantage point. Well, you could get, you know, people in the Reformed tradition who are kind of like, exactly how does this, propitiation, thing fit together with the other scripture. And it could be like that, driving. The more they understand, quote unquote, understand, you could like read John MacArthur's sort of whole commentary of the Bible and kind of download it into your brain and be like, okay, I'm getting there now, but I need to get further and further. You could be driving all the more of these angles, 3 or 4 of them at the same time, and be a long way from reality. Something on the inside, inner child or shame, or a part of your genuine spirituality or whatever it is just getting like battered, and it's like, what the heck's going on? And, that could be under the surface, but you wouldn't notice it really.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting to me because I developed what I see now as what you described, religious scrupulosity, as a young kid growing up in a very fundamentalist Christian home. But I think it was maybe for different reasons, in the sense that I was raised with this sort of surveilling God, this sort of fear of the rapture, fear of going to hell. And that developed in me as a young person, a fear of going to hell or being left behind in the rapture and those kind of things. So I would study my Bible. I would pray the sinner's prayer. I would make sure I wasn't thinking bad thoughts. And I developed what I think is religious scrupulosity. Does that relate to what you're describing in terms of religious addiction? Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, it's the sort of larger movement, as I understand it at the moment, in the whole people deconstructing and ex-cult survivors and all that kind of thing, is to identify religious trauma. And I think it would certainly be, I mean, a young mind, and I know Marlene Weiner and other people have written about this a lot, a young mind doesn't know what to do with an overwhelming supreme being, a creator who hates you and loves you, and you're going to be condemned and you think you'll probably be okay, but you're not sure. That message is reinforced again and again. The temptation to ritualize your way out of it is, I mean, any tendency at all to OCD, those are kind of like the perfect conditions for it to come out. Now, people leave the church and sort of, one way or another, that mindset recedes or, goes away to a greater extent. I think somebody I would identify as a religious addict might be somebody who experiences the highs and lows of that to such a degree that, standing up again in a meeting, and the high of, oh, I must be forgiven now again, and the low of, all the shame and low self-esteem, which is really being perpetuated by the teaching and the environment to a large extent. It's kind of like some people, like alcoholics, and they quit drinking, and they're like, oh, I thought you were one, and you're not really. And some people leave the church and they're kind of okay. Or some people have a sort of a brain chemistry thing where the lights have been going on so strongly, by the lights I mean kind of like neurotransmitters and that kind of reaction, that they are kind of having a process addiction experience like a workaholic or a gambling addict might. And some of the insights from people who've recovered from those addictions can be helpful maybe to those people, although they'd probably be just at home in a religious trauma recovery or all the other things that are available, really.
It seems like it relates to people, as you say, who might have a tendency towards addictive or compulsive behaviors. Is that correct? Because you're talking about gambling addiction or other addictions, people with addictive personalities. So for them, religion can be an opiate as well. Because I've talked to people about this before, and they're saying, when I went to church, for example, which is our experience, chasing that religious high week in and week out, especially in your more, as you say, charismatic and Pentecostal circles, where the worship is so exuberant, so over the top, such an emotive experience that you get drawn up into this experience, and then you're always chasing that and chasing that and chasing that. Do you find that's the case, that it tends to maybe relate more to people who have an addictive kind of personality?
Yeah, at the moment, I would say that's what I would say. Yeah. So, I mean, famously as well, you get people in the church who are quite famous and very, very on fire for God and all those things we used to say. And then it's revealed, and actually, he's got a secret life of prostitution. I'm thinking of Ravi Zacharias and Jimmy Swaggart and those types of people. I don't know if they're religious addicts, but take them as an example your listeners might know. And instead of thinking, oh, that's really good, the Christian bit, and that's really bad, the sexual acting out bit. Obviously, the sexual acting out was bad for the people who were victimized by it. But in terms of brain chemistry, that's the thing with addiction, is like, the brain doesn't know this is good or this is bad. It's trying to find what some people have called homeostasis, a balance of satiation. So it's like, oh yeah, give me some of the lust thing, or give me some of the religious high. And in that cocktail in the mind, although it sort of tears you apart in terms of your experience of shame and dissonance and everything, the brain doesn't really care. It's like, yeah, actually that sex and religion thing works quite well together. And so far we're seeing people with sexual addiction or lust problems, and religious addiction seem to be comorbid, I think it's it's a word, but fortunately it hasn't been morbid for anyone we know yet.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and maybe food as well, the other one.
Could be, yeah. So any kind of compulsive addiction. Looking at your landing page, I found this explanation really interesting. You talk about, describing religious addiction. You say it's a compulsive, mood-altering religious practice. And I like what you say. You say that consequences of religious addiction can take many forms, but the disease leads the addict into high levels of unmanageability, including mental health problems, self-hatred, PTSD, relationship, and financial problems. The religious addict has developed the capacity to produce a spiritual high and or trance-like state, the source of which the addict attributes to a higher power. But in reality, the cause is a pathological response in the mind of the addict to heavily ritualized behavior. And what I found interesting about that is I've been going through Robert Lifton's Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, which is an interesting book about cult, practices, brainwashing and all that. And he talks about milieu control and mystical manipulation are two of the hallmarks of what cults and groups use to manipulate their followers into thinking. This is what he calls the psychology of the pawn. It's planned spontaneity. It seems spontaneous, but it's actually rehearsed and choreographed, those exuberant experiences. And I'm thinking, does that feed into your definition of religious addiction? We were actually pawns in a system.
I think you're probably right, Clint. I mean, I haven't put those two ideas together in my own mind before, but when you were saying about, was it something like planned sort of magical spontaneity or something? Right. Is that when where the guy goes up and he's kind of like, well, imagine he goes, tonight I really feel there's something happening and I think you can feel it too. That kind of whole shtick.
The spirit's about to move.
Yeah, well, quite. And I mean, what comes out of that for me initially is the idea that there is a connection between all the people in that room. And we are, at the time, the people in the seats listening to the leaders who are doing that, we are quite vulnerable, to them leading us around like that. And one thing, I mean, I've actually gone from myself, I mean, who knows what I'll be like tomorrow, but right now I've gone from sort of like a level 6 Richard Dawkins atheist, there is no God, black hole deconstruction, that's it, the sort of thinking, is there anything that could be reconciled about this? Is there something quote unquote Christian that's just been built up psychically and so on? Is there something like a heart or whatever it is? Now, if I were to explore that in a Christian context, I would not go to anywhere there was any preaching or anywhere there was any worship because, and I think other studies have shown this, that criticality, and sort of like independence, as soon as you're pitched slightly lower than somebody, slightly higher than you on a stage, and they've got amplification, and they've got sort of that kind of rhetorical situation where they're telling you something that you're supposed to believe, there's something, possibly evolutionary mechanism, which just basically switches off and will be like, yeah, just do that to me. So with the music and everything else, I think the religious addict is especially vulnerable to that. So the only place I would go right now, and it's partly because it's the opposite of my Reformed tradition. I mean, I was like, well, Catholics are obviously completely wrong. The church next door, they're obviously completely wrong. Everyone's got that thing about everyone else is completely wrong. So the wrongest of all was Mary, quote unquote, worship and Latin Mass. If I can't understand it and I can just sit there and my soul's there, all sort of Eastern Orthodox, I might give that a try. That'd be my starting point. No preaching, because the brain just, whatever the brain chemistry is doing, the preaching and the worship triggers it. And I can't tell the difference between what might be a healthy spiritual experience and what is the pathological variety in that situation.
It seems like you're describing that person who just takes their spirituality, their religiosity to another whole level. One of your articles I liked was, what is it? The Icarus Fellowship. And you talk about this story, remembering years and years later, the story of Icarus. Here's this Greek sort of mythology, flies too close to the sun and the wax in his, wings melts and he crashes into the sea. And that's a stereotype or an archetype of religious addicts. And I like what you say. You say, we love the sun so much, talking about religious addicts. We didn't know our wings would melt. What possible harm could the sun, the source of our lives, do unto us, was our reasoning. while other believers simply existed in a more moderate, sustainable psychic envelope, we pushed ever onwards into the light until it burned through our psycho-spiritual structures and left us in ruins. So that's a striking image, isn't it? You're like Icarus, who flew too close to the sun, and now you've crashed and burned, whereas other people seem to be able to maintain a sort of maybe a slightly more healthy balance.
Yeah. Well, these were the people, like those of us who've come from like being so spiritual. These were the lukewarm believers. These were the, Revelations 2, whatever it is.
Yeah,
these are going to get spat out of the mouth. Be careful, you've got a spiritual life that's going to last you your whole life. That's not good enough. I mean, absolutely. I mean, so what it speaks to me today, Clint, is that, in the rhetoric of, evangelical Christianity broadly, you get the idea of a universal gospel, which is, as long as you're not too wrong, the thoughts in your head aren't too wrong, when you get your faith, grace moment, you're basically saved and you're in the club. That's universal, and it's the same experience for everybody, whether you've had a good family, bad family, you're in this church, that church. It's a universal salvation experience. And then you start reading the Bible, and it's like, okay, so basically you can exercise your will and your spiritual practices and direct yourself to go down this path as much as you want, and nothing can possibly go wrong. Maybe in your life, depending on the theology, something bad could happen in your life, but nothing will go wrong for you spiritually. Now, this turns out for religious addicts to be completely wrong, because it's dogma and it doesn't relate to organic living beings, which is what we are. Whatever faith rests, in the heart, mind, psyche, whatever it is, and obviously humans have had belief systems for quite a while. There's something there that will kind of like take one on board, be it communism or neoliberalism or Buddhism or what have you. But it's part of an organic body, and it's possibly even. So sometimes this is getting a bit maybe rarefied, but sometimes when life throws things up, it does so on the basis of analogies to things that already exist. So we talk about, well, my heart, I love God in my heart, I love my wife in my heart, and we mean sort of the place where we feel our emotions. But that could be an analogy to the actual physical blood pumping heart that life has simply put into us because it knows that one thing worked and it's repurposed it. You see that in things like the duck-billed platypus, but although it's still physical there, it's got a beak and webbed feet, and it's like there's little things that could get plucked and recycled. So maybe I'm talking about something slightly more than evolution there, but things seem to get recycled. But the point about it is that it's an organic thing. Whatever spirituality is or is not, it's organic. It can be overwhelmed. It can be destroyed by things that you think are good. And you can overwhelm yourself with so much energy that it just cannot sustain it. And it's as if it sucks back in like the two things on a snail. They're not antlers, are they? Well,
the little antenna.
Yeah, it sucks back in. Your heart's like, I'm not doing. You think that's a good idea to pray without ceasing and crucify the flesh? I don't think it's a good idea, because the heart is not dogmatic. It's organic. It's part of our life. So you hit it with dogma, and in the end, if you do it in the addictive way, you'll basically destroy yourself.
So in the context, let's say, of our example of Christianity, evangelicalism, does the religious addict look down his or her nose at those people with a, quote, simple faith that you just described? It's not enough just to have a simple faith. You've got to have all the answers, because I can remember as an evangelical, I got into things like apologetics. I got into, theology. I read Calvin. I read Luther. I read Augustine. I wanted to find out answers to my faith, as you say, those questions. And it wasn't just enough for me to satisfy my own, desires and questions and issues and things. I wanted to be able to teach other people and be that sort of expert, which is partly why I became a pastor and then a Bible college teacher, I think, because I wanted to be in that elevated position, having all the, quote, answers. Does that relate to your experience at all?
Yes, it does. And people we've talked to who've come along have had some experiences quite similar to that as well. As I see it now, so, on one level for me, it was about trance. On one level, it was about magical thinking, ritualization. But on another level, being of that type of mind as well, where, I would read a lot. And essentially, I'm sort of orientated towards truth seeking, which is a good thing, as long as it doesn't get hijacked by dogma. Hijacked by dogma. So it can become like, I will have so complex and so complete a worldview that nothing can sort of get through, which is sort of fundamentally, I guess, a way of defending yourself against things that don't fit. In the process of doing that, I've had to minimize the effect of evolution on the Christian worldview and such such things. But that defense can be pursued compulsively. I remember, I think it's Phil Fernandez was the one I was listening to. He's got loads and loads of podcasts about, what do you say to this? He's sort of like a Josh McDowell, but he's sort of online, sort of like, what would you say to this? What would you say to that? As if I could fill in all the brick in the wall so that no bad things could get through and cause doubt, I suppose, doubt and fear, possibly what I was trying to avoid fundamentally.
Yeah, I can remember that, going to Bible college and seminary and looking up to my professors for that very reason, because I felt that these men and women had figured it out, And I remember asking one of my theology professors, I said to him, so when did it all sort of come together for you? When did you sort of figure it all out, And that question, I think, reveals a lot about where I was coming from, that idea that you could, quote, put it all together as a Christian or whatever your religion is and have it all sort of figured out. All the pieces would fall into place and I wouldn't have any more doubts or concerns or issues or anything. Do you feel that you resonate with that sort of description?
Yeah, definitely. And of course, so whether it's, analogies to other addictions could be insightful. So the satiation and the blocking the world out of hard drug use, which I know mostly from films and that kind of thing, or the complete unreality, of somebody completely absorbed with lust. It's so absorbing that you might not notice that you're about to get sacked. You hear stories about people getting sacked at work or something from using pornography on the internet or what have you. That's how removed from reality, one is. So the natural sort of existential questions that one has, even people with, reconstructed a kind of a spirituality now, like whether it's like, well, I connect with nature, or I love fish, or, there could be a higher power or whatever. We don't quite know what it is. Anything like that leaves you open to the winds of existential doubt and the fundamental acknowledgement of your own sort of mortality, at least as we understand it. Not just that, but all kinds of things go wrong. And magical thinking in religious addiction is an antidote to that as well, where, you think any day now this will happen, or God's about to do this, or I'm divinely protected against that. But actually, in order, for us to grow up, for me to grow up anyway, I need to face the reality, which is any of those things could happen to me. The existential winds are blowing, fear and doubt are here, as well as joy and meaning and creativity and all those other things, really.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of that now, aren't we? Certainly in America, I'm 100% vaccinated by the blood of Jesus. I don't need the COVID jab, Psalm 91 and all that. We're going to be back in just a few minutes in this conversation with Michael from the Religious Addicts Anonymous. When we come back, we're going to be getting into this issue of signs and symptoms of religious addiction. Maybe as we've been talking in the first half, you've been thinking, wait a minute, I might be, or I might have been a religious addict if, like me, you came out of a fundamentalist controlling or high controlling cult or group, something like that. Then there's every chance that you develop some form of religious scrupulosity like I did. We're going to be talking about that. And then we're also going to be talking about how do you recover. It's, in a way, it is a compulsive sort of addiction. We're going to get into this issue of getting help. How do you recover? How do you reconstruct? How do you rebuild a new life apart from being a religious addict? So stay tuned for that coming after the second half. I just wanted to mention what's coming up in the next couple of episodes here. I've had a couple of really fascinating conversations already. They've been recorded. I talked the other week with Dr. Terry Daniel of the Ask Dr. Death podcast, and we are going to be talking about her upcoming conference, which is the Conference on Death, Grief, and Belief. That's going to be in July. Now, it is going to be held in Portland, Oregon. There's going to be an actual event, an in-person event. However, you will be able to get access to all of the sessions afterwards. They're all going to be recorded. Terry has got some just unbelievable guests coming in for that conference. She's got, for example, Seth Andrews, the host of The Thinking Atheist, along with Frank and Dan from the Thank God I'm Atheist podcast. I'm also going to be one of the presenters. I'm doing a talk on a paper that I wrote a few years ago called What Happens After People Leave the Church, and that's gotten a lot of traction, talking about different paths that people follow after they leave religion behind. And so if you want to be a part of that, you can get a discount by using the code MINDSHIFT when you book your tickets for the live event. That is the deathgriefandbelief.com website. And then after the episode with Dr. Terry Daniel, I've got a conversation coming out with Dr. David DeAndre. I chatted with him the other week. He's an expat like myself. We have actually a lot in common. He lives in Canada now, but for years he was a missionary in Ukraine. Both of us come out of the States. We both come out of sort of teaching theology and Bible studies and all those kind of things. We were deep into evangelicalism, and he, like me, has walked away from it all, and he shares his stories. So that's going to be a really interesting conversation coming up with Dr. David DeAndre. And in fact, we've got a couple other really cool things to announce, and that is that on the 6th of February, which is just a couple days after this episode drops, we've got our very first Mindshift patrons only Zoom call on the 6th of February. We do that every month, and that is the first one we've done in 2022. And then on the 27th of February, we've got Rebecca Drumsta coming back. She's going to be our guest on our Mindshift Zoom call that we do every month. And we're going to be talking about her book, When Family Hurts. And she was just a guest a couple of episodes ago talking about her book. So if you got a lot out of that discussion, you'll be enjoying this conversation with Rebecca Drumsta. And then next month in March, we're going to have Michael from this very podcast episode now. He's going to be coming back in next month to be our guest for that call. And then we've also got Dr. David DeAndre coming back in April. So these are former guests that we want to have back on. If you want to get a chance to meet these people, have an hour-long discussion with them, typically about the last Sunday of the month, then you need to support the show on Patreon. That is how you get access both to the patrons-only Zoom calls as well as our monthly Mindshift Zoom calls. So that is a way for you to get involved, to join that community. Anyway, let's get on back into this discussion with Michael from the Religious Addicts Anonymous, exploring religious addiction. Another interesting article on your site, Signs and Symptoms of Religious Addiction. I can certainly resonate with the top 5. What does the religious addiction look like? You talk about unspoken dread that you could be damned unless compulsive ritual practices are completed on time. Practice of prayer is inherently mind-altering. Number 3, widespread judgment of other people in the faith community for not being spiritual enough or not committed enough. Number 4, belief that one's own doctrine is the most correct, and it could possibly be other denominations, other people are wrong. And then number 5, deep fear of spiritual contamination, such as rock music and liturgy of other denominations and TV, movies. Anything could be spiritual contamination. I can definitely resonate with all 5 of those things on the list, you know. And it's kind of sad. Maybe I'm thinking now, was I a religious addict, when I was a Christian? What did it look like for you? I mean, what were some of those things that I read off the list on your sort of daily practices? What did it look like?
Well, so the last 4 or 5 years before I started this phase of recovery, I had very high anxiety, so much to the point that I'd be sitting at my desk at work and I would feel quite paranoid about all the people around me, like just unable to sort of relax and just do the work properly. And I basically resolved that I was going to get miracled out of this anxiety. So rather than exploring the roots of it, and so on. So every single day for 5 years, I was praying for the breakthrough. And that would be half an hour in the morning, half an hour on the train to church. When things would start to get uncomfortable, I would take time out either outside in my lunch hour and pray again. Might be listening to worship music. So particularly the sort of rituals I had were like, so I would have, although I thought it might be slightly naughty because it did mean there was an image in my mind. I had an image in my mind of Christ that had arisen in me from the Gospels, and I would put on something like Bethel or Hillsong, and I would just sort of pray into that image, you know, just like pray and worship, and I'd be sort of transported. But progressively in that 4 or 5 year period, the effect of those sort of prayers and so on, association and the sort of tranciness of it, whether it decreased or not, it felt like it decreased because the anxiety and the discomfort, and then COVID started as well. It just wasn't working. It was like a classic case of, you know, I've drunk 10 pints, as we say over here, and I couldn't get drunk, which is what alcoholics say. You know, the drink stopped working, and it's like. But spiritual contamination is the other one I was going to mention. So now, the way I understand this now is that faith exists in a kind of a theatre of the imagination, which is kind of semi-stable. So once you've kind of erected it, it will stay for a while. So when you focus on things like holiness, purity, the blood of Christ, sort of salvation from darkness into light, all of those images and everything that feeds into that construction, is there. And there's a temptation, or rather it's part of the central part of the discourse, that you keep it pure. You're told that you're keeping your soul pure or your heart pure, and I'm not discounting that completely as a possibility. But the main thing I can see is that you're keeping your imagination pure. So what happens when you then go away and listen to Metallica, or you watch The Evil Dead, you play one of the video games, the zombies or whatever? Not, I would say, that your soul is becoming contaminated, but your imagination, the envelope of the imagination is kind of being challenged. Now, this is where scrupulousness and OCD can come in. If you love and live in that purity so much, particularly as a means of avoiding damnation, which we mentioned already, it's quite a big motivation, then any little thing like, oh, I saw a pop video, Michael Jackson's Thriller, and I think maybe there was a resonance of that, and it's on me, and I need the blood of Christ. And I was very, very lost in all that.
Well, it reminds me just what you said, two more of Robert Lipton's categories. He talked about what groups put on us. They put on this demand for purity, and then the cult of confession, which is off the back of the demand for purity. So religious groups are very good at putting sort of demands on their followers that they will never be able to achieve or live up to. And then when we inevitably fail, the religion says, well, now you've got to confess your sins. So it becomes this, again, that can become a religious addiction cycle, I think, where I'm failing, but I can seek forgiveness. I'm failing, but I can seek forgiveness. And that itself becomes a compulsive religious cycle, can it?
Certainly, yeah, and you see it as well in sort of all over society as well. Like in this country, we have a thing where the Conservative Party kill one of their leaders, and they might be about to do it now, or the kind of horrible argument in the marriage, and then wonderful reunion, and there's a kind of, it could be a human thing where Christianity is playing a very sort of damaging role in this right now. But in history, there's been this thing about ritual killings and ritual sacrifices throughout the human history, and it seems like I think it was Jung was writing about this, that even in secular societies there are kind of ritual killings, if not literally, and things like Boris Johnson might be about to go, but certainly within the church, obviously Christ himself is a sort of a ritual killing, so there's that. But although it's been done once and for all, so that is final. But we need to keep doing it because of our psychology or whatever, dogma or whatever. So we are the ones who need to keep being wrong, because he doesn't need to keep being killed again, but we need to keep being, slamming ourselves up against that sacrifice again and again and again. And it's, I mean, if you think about all of the psychic elements we have, inheritance of all of our human experience, many of them are creative and can be loving and communitarian, but there's still the shadow, isn't there? There's the dark side. We do inherit a little bit of the dark side as well, which, people now involved in sort of serious sort of growing up, in deconstruction and so on, have noticed that it's not necessarily evil. You have a thought, it's not necessarily evil, maybe it's just like the shadow, and you're trying to sort of deal with that. But Christians who don't know with that, they've got the shadow, both the leaders and the individuals, and they keep smashing their shadow up against the cross, and it doesn't fix it. It doesn't reduce shame. It doesn't reduce shadow material, unless you're in a very conducive type of faith environment where it just so happens they're in tune with what actually will help you grow up. And there is some Christianity like that.
Yeah. What are the steps to recovery then for the religious addict? Because some of your writings, you kind of resonate with a 12-step program. You talk about a higher power. One of your articles, you talk about learning to rely on myself, though, as opposed to that so-called higher power, which is sort of a universal 12-step program thing. They don't necessarily say it's God, the higher power. It's just you must rely on the higher power to cure you of your addiction. In that case, maybe alcohol or whatever it might be. How does a religious addict, get those steps to recovery?
Truthfully, we're not sure. So the first thing we do, and we do know this, is that you stop all compulsive religious practices. Now, for the religious addict, it sounds simple, right? For the religious addict who hasn't yet completely burned out or hit the brick wall, it's almost impossible, because the fear and the dread and hell itself, the hell that you carry inside of you already, will come to the surface, the thing that you've been trying to repress with your addiction. So, step one we see, we admitted this isn't really formally written down, but something like, we admitted we were powerless over our compulsive religious practices and we stopped doing them, and then what seems to happen is the void comes up. Now, the void is just a word for all of the repressed material, all of the existential sort of fear, all of the doubt that the total 360-degree worldview was meant to be keeping out. Well, it's here, are we just a rock, floating around the sun? All the dread, it's literally like, oh my God, I've turned into Nietzsche and Jean-Paul Sartre and, all these people who just,
nihilism
were being
sets in.
Exactly, being destroyed by their lack of faith. Now that's me. And so far, what some of us have noticed, and we're still a very small community, is that there is a type of an end to that, or that after a while, the void, it's almost like in 2001, is it, where they go through a sort of teleport, black hole thing, and they come out the other side, it's like, oh God, there is something like on the other side. So some people, that's like, I never want to go near any spirituality again. I'm doing therapy, I'm playing football, I'm doing all the psychic energy that was going into that and rebalancing it, I need a healthy life balance. For some people, it's like, well, maybe there's something in there that wasn't just purely pathological. Maybe there's something there. And I'm drawn to this a bit because my family is still largely Christian. Some of my best friends are Christian, and the ones who aren't sort of being destroyed by it, on a good day, they have a kind of a love and a something about them that is there. It just seems to be there. So what interests me is, without erecting the whole sort of theatre of dogmatic Christianity, what does it take to plug into whatever it is that makes some people more loving? Without being also hateful as well at the weekends or whatever. They're just more like, loving, and they just genuinely are like that. Throw out hell, throw out this, throw out that. The Gospel of John was not an eyewitness account. There's probably only 12. That's fine. Do everything you need to do. But at the end of the day, what I'm wondering is, and I suppose this pertains to step 2 and 3, which is the question, is there hope for, I have got a tiny hope that Leo Booth, actually, who wrote the original book on religious addiction, he's written quite a lot about different kinds of spirituality that can arise after the addictive kind of like chaos has ended. And I'm quite hopeful that, grace, a type of grace has to be, anyone exploring this coming out of religious addiction needs to be completely sure, and they know for a fact that they never have to do any ritual again, never. Whether Christ literally died or literally didn't die, or whether, whatever, they never have to do any other ritual. If there's a higher power and it's not that, it's not worth anything. So you don't have to do anything, never again. But then if once the void has passed, there's something arises, something organic and something real, the organic thing that we broke in our practices, if it gets fixed a little bit, it can be like, oh God, maybe I'll just go and sit by the river and, read the Upanishads, or, or just a little bit of it, or some sort of secularized version of it, or listen to Eckhart Tolle, or, and then certain things can come back in maybe in a healthy way, hopefully.
You have to find that balance, though. I can certainly resonate with what you're saying, because maybe I was a religious addict, because, that number one thing on your list, that practicing of compulsive religious rituals, reading my Bible every day, praying every day, doing those observed practices, those rituals. And if I didn't do them, I was in dread of, I'm going to get in trouble here. God's going to judge me. God's going to punish me. Bad things are going to happen. And I haven't read my Bible. I haven't prayed. I haven't done a quiet time, in over a decade. But it took a long, long time to, like you say, rid myself of that dread of, oh my God, I'm going to get punished. Something bad's going to happen. So time surely must be a healer in some sense, isn't it? When you, like you say, you quit doing those practices. It's not easy at first, but over time, they hold kind of lessons on us, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And fundamentally, there's a position an individual takes where they're in the center of a community and in the center of a discourse that is close to the outside world, is what the community is doing with all that apologetics and all that. 6,000-year-old Earth or whatever, burn the science books. We're keeping all that in. And in the individual's life, it's the same. The shutters are down in the mind. And when all that breaks down, and the fear comes and the truth comes, or more truth comes and the reality hits, time certainly as we go through life with the light, as it were, coming in, and that enclosedness has ended, certainly there are self-healing properties in the mind and in the body. And if there weren't, we'd really, really be in trouble. And even for religious addicts, that can be like a step two. We came to believe, the original step two is we came to believe in a power greater than ourselves, restore us to sanity. But for religious addicts, that power could be the self-healing properties of the mind and time, which compared to banging your head, against a brick wall with the Names of God Bible or the John MacArthur Study Bible or whatever, you literally will get better if you stop doing that. It might take you 18 months, but you'll get better.
Your own mental health. Yeah, and it's funny because I can hear those tapes playing even now. Years later, I'm going out with someone who's, I'm divorced, and that's a big thing. I'm seeing somebody, and that's a big thing. And things that I would have done, I shouldn't be dating her because she's not a Christian. I can hear those tapes playing. You shouldn't be unequally yoked with an unbeliever. That's a biblical command, isn't it? And I'm thinking, okay, I can consciously set those things aside. Those imperatives don't have the power over me that they once would have. I can remember breaking up with someone before I got married years ago because she wasn't a Christian, and I had this big chat with her about, well, we're not going to be able to go out. I really like you, but you're not a Christian and I'm a Christian. And that's, and you think, my God, what kind of a life was that? But that's how we did it, didn't we? That was what the Bible said.
Sure. Actually, because I had a backsliding phase, quote unquote, in my teens, or late teens, and my version of that then, because I obviously imported it from the church, was, oh, you don't like Mudhoney and Nirvana, or Dinosaur Jr., or these grunge bands that I like, so I can't date you. So it's sort of like I took that into my sort of like early backsliding, but yeah, you're right. I mean, the tapes play, don't they? And then it's sort of like people have their own ways, I guess. It's like the one I'm doing a lot of now is from the sort of Eastern tradition of sort of noticing. We're saying, oh, there's a thought, and you say, okay, that thought is observed. Who is observing it? What is observing it? Well, it must be something that doesn't believe that thought. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to contain it like that. And then keeping that sort of mindful light on it, it seems to kind of go like, blah, 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 and either recede or go away again till next time or whatever. Seems to work pretty well.
Seems to work, yeah. And would therapy play any role in this? Because obviously you've got your group. I don't know how big it is, but you're saying it's a fairly small community now. Would that be a helpful pattern for someone to maybe get involved in seeking therapy? Because I'm thinking too, some therapists don't understand anything about things like religious trauma syndrome or religious addiction. Are you finding that to be the case in terms of therapists? They don't even know what you're talking about?
What the term they use, which I've heard a few therapists use, is spiritual bypass, and that has come into some of the literature. And they'll say that for religious addiction. I think often. I think if anyone was like who listened to this was thinking of trying to find a therapist, it might be worth asking them if they've done any work with people who have a history of like a pretty major sort of spiritual bypass, or if they can, or even things like OCD and OCD disassociation. So therapists who've got experience of people who've just lived in a dream world, which is kind of like the religious addicts, essentially, being as a stimulus for that and a proclivity and a desire to do that. So something like OCD and dream world states, if they've got any, but especially if they're aware of spiritual bypass. And certainly it's hugely, hugely helpful.
Well, I found that concept of spiritual bypassing, that was a huge one for me. This idea that you're hiding behind religion or spirituality, using that as a mask or a screen to hide actually the real issues, which is what are going on in your mental health or whatever it might be. Is that how you understand spiritual bypassing? How does that relate to religious addiction?
Yeah, well, I think it's central to it. I mean, as I understand it today, I was going to say ideally, but there probably is no ideal as such. They've got a utopian vision of a person whose sort of mind and body and everything else is sort of in balance. So when an emotion comes up, they can say, "Oh, that's anger," or they could be an experience where they feel disproportionately angry, and they'll say, "Oh, that's a bit like something happened to me in my childhood, and that's why I'm doing that." And they'll have sort of a bit of time and space. So there's sort of a fairly healthy recognition of reality as it is. That would be a kind of a sort of balanced, slightly utopian vision of a person. So spiritual bypass is kind of like, oh, I felt slightly angry towards that person when I was driving. So you repent, you pray for them, you know, you ask for the God's grace that you'll drive sort of like better. You put the worship music on, you know, you pray
Put
for
that
a parking
Hillsong
space. I love
on.
it when Christians say that. Yeah.
It should have already been playing, man. What are you talking about?
Yeah, I know. Yeah, and then there's a parking space there, and it's like it's all fine.
Well, God must have given you that parking spot, you know, because you repented of that road rage.
Yeah. Parking space miracles are the best, aren't they?
Oh, they're absolute miracles.
But I think, and I think you might have alluded to this, that its roots, and we've talked about therapy and everything, its roots could be quite early on. So, you know, you have children who have to disassociate because of trauma of various kinds, sexual trauma or being beaten up or abandonment or whatever. So what you're going to do, you're not going to starkly as a 5-year-old face the truth of what your mum and dad are really like, or whoever it is. So what happens, you know, Dolly and Pony and Unicorn and the dream world starts to take on. So the mind will actually open up for you, either helpfully or unhelpfully, a space, and you can kind of go and live in there. You know, it's sort of like, oh God, what's one of those sci-fi? Almost like when Neo goes in the Matrix, you know, where he gets plugged in for the first time. It's like the white room, you know. It's like, oh, what should we download today? You know, and sort of sexual addiction is like this as well, you know, and all the sort of fantasy things. So, you know, spiritual bypass. It's like now I've got this space. It's already there. But then either you're already introduced or you get introduced to a very powerful religious rhetoric and a very sort of stimulating, quote unquote, environment. And the space is already there. So it just, the brain chemistry and everything just takes you straight up in there, which you're still probably avoiding bad things that happened to you in the past. And you could be avoiding quite a lot of, you know, what the work we could be doing to grow up today, and not to mention, of course, a huge amount of emotional pain, any sort of trauma, even, you know, especially religious trauma, but also parental trauma. The addict, I mean, I've spoken to quite a lot of addicts. You know, I've been in recovery 20 years, not for this, but for, you know, broadly speaking, the pain people go through. Like, it's, people don't talk about it on TV or on films. Like, oh, it's my 7th year of straight emotional pain as I try and grow up. You know, these stories don't really make it into mainstream media. Addicts tell them, and it's quite hard to be willing. It is, I'm just going to go back to the Matrix again. It really kind of is like, oh God, I took the red pill, and it's kind of like, it's a bit gritty and grimy down here, you know, no wonder. And then you go, no wonder I had that severe spiritual bypass for 20 years or whatever it was.
And then, like the one guy, I'm choosing to go back into the Matrix. I know this, I know this steak isn't real, but you know what? I don't care.
Yeah,
I'm gonna go back into the fantasy. I'm going to go back and plug into the Matrix. As long as I'm rich and famous and, you know, whatever, I don't care. Oh man,
absolutely.
I just watched all 3 Matrix films again the other day, and I thought, okay, I need to sit down and watch these again. There's a lot of stuff going on in there. Well, I'm thinking too, if someone is resonating with what we're talking about, thinking, okay, maybe I was a spiritual addict, maybe I am a spiritual addict. How can they find your group? How can they plug into this small but hopefully growing community?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I mean, well, the website's there, and there's a contact page on there. That gets anyone who sends an email will come to me, and I'll just respond to them. At the moment, there's one Zoom meeting a week, and it's based on a time that the existing members are able to attend. But if we get inquiries and that time doesn't suit, then we'll do everything we can to support and have other meetings. You know, so essentially it would be like sending an email and then, if possible, coming along to a meeting. The book that's out there, it's often in secondhand outlets now. It's called When God Becomes a Drug, which is by Leo Booth. I think it's about 20 years old now, but still available. And people can read that. They can send us an email. The religious trauma communities will be very helpful as well. I know Marlene Weinell's got a survivors group there, and they'll be completely down with people hearing stories like that. Any kind of OCD group could also be helpful. But as far as we are, you know, we're also there, and we're happy to deal with inquiries, and we hope that someone hears this and it could be helpful, that we'll be able to, we'll just talk about what happened and how we're going to try and get well, really, and try and work out as we go along, really.
Right. So your website is religiousaddicts.wordpress.com. Are you available on any sort of social media as well? Do you have a Twitter presence, Facebook? Are you on any other social media?
The Facebook group is there. Yeah, I think I haven't pressed activate, but I will this week. It's just, it hasn't got any members, and I'm sort of like,
you kind of need members
because it's new.
Oh, right. It's just that Maybe we can get a couple of members off the back of this episode then.
That'd be awesome.
But it sounds like the best place is the website, isn't it? That's sort of the first port of call. Then they can contact you and then get in touch maybe with that community.
Yeah, and I'll make sure the Facebook group says so that. I'll just be searching for religious. I think it's religious addiction is the wording there. There's no other Facebook group like that, so there's no chance of getting the other one.
The Facebook search.
We're an elite group.
Yeah, there's nobody in there. You're so elite.
Yeah. I knew I was special and different.
Yeah, I don't have any followers, but I'm special and different. Well, listen, Michael, thanks so much, man. It's been a really interesting chat with you. I'm glad that I said, like I say, I had a chance to read your articles again this week. Now I'm thinking I might have been a religious addict. So it's given me a lot of food for thought. Hopefully people will resonate with what we've talked about. I'm hoping too that, like I say, off the back of this episode, people will contact you and, maybe get some help, get some, counseling, therapies, group support, whatever it might be for being a religious addict.
Yeah, I hope so, Clint. Yeah, I mean, we all want to get well, don't we? Those of us who are sort of inclined towards others, and many people deconstructing are like that. And if we can be of any help, and because we learn so much from anyone who comes along, and I think that the community that we're all part of with your podcast is part of that, and the other people podcasting. And without that knowledge that it comes into all those bits of content, it'd be terrible, wouldn't it? There'd be nowhere to go because you wouldn't have anyone who's understanding you. And it's like that with religious addiction as well. And yeah, I think it'd be happy to try and help.
Okay, listen, thank you so much for chatting. Let's definitely keep in touch, and we will talk again.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ken.